fallen star, its shattered hull half buried in Meridian's rust-colored soil. Smoke curled upward in thin black ribbons, twisting against the copper sky as if the planet itself was exhaling the last breath of the wreck. Sparks hissed and danced across the torn metal plates, each one a fleeting echo of the violence that had brought the vessel down. Heat shimmered in the air, carrying with it the acrid stench of scorched alloy, burned synthetics, and something else, something organic. Mark Alden stood at the edge of the crater, his boots sinking slightly into the brittle ground. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his glove and shoved his goggles onto his forehead. The crash had drawn half the settlement out of their hovels, but curiosity had already burned out into resignation. A couple of alien responders, Meridian natives with pale, ridged faces, climbed the jagged wreckage, scanning with their sensors one last time. "No survivors," one called down, his voice rough and certain. Another spat on the dirt. "Strip it for parts and leave the rest." Just another piece of sky trash. Mark should have turned back like the others. He wasn't a medic, wasn't a soldier. Just a mechanic who patched worn-out haulers and fixed atmospheric turbines when they coughed to death. But something kept his eyes locked on the twisted metal, on the gaping wound in the starship's side. A whisper in his gut told him the story wasn't finished. He stepped forward, boots crunching on shards of glassy debris. "Hey," Trex, the tallest of the Meridians, called after him. "What are you doing?" "Sensors read zero life signs." Mark ignored him, sliding down the slope of rusted earth toward the breach. Heat radiated off the hull like an open furnace. The ship's markings were foreign, painted in elegant slashes of silver and violet across orange plating, Solarian design. He'd seen their merchant cruisers before, sleek, untouchable, proud. Nothing about this ruin looked proud. Inside, the cockpit was a tomb of twisted beams and shattered panels. He moved carefully, brushing aside dangling wires that sparked like angry snakes. Then he saw it a flicker. So faint he thought it was. A trick of the smoke. But no, there. A movement, small and struggling, against the pilot's seat. Mark's heart kicked hard in his chest as he clambered over the wreckage. The pilot was humanoid, female by the look of her form-fitting flight. Gear, what remained of it. Her skin was a brilliant orange, slick with a strange blue fluid that clung to her like liquid crystal. Her silver-white hair was matted and streaked with ash, and she had no limbs. Both arms ended in ragged stumps just past the shoulders. Her legs gone completely. Just charred fabric and sealing foam where hips should have been. She should have been dead. Every chart, every protocol, every damn law in her culture said she was already gone. But then her chest rose in the smallest, shallowest breath. Holy. Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. Behind him, Trex climbed through the breach. One glance and the Meridian's ridged face twisted in something like pity. "Alden, don't. It's over. Solarian law quadruple amputation means release. Mercy." "You call this mercy?" Mark's voice was sharp as steel. "It's their way," another alien said from the hatch. "Let her go." But Mark was already unfastening the restraints. The pilot's head turned, slow and fragile, violet eyes finding his face with startling clarity. For a moment, time hung still between them, smoke curling, metal hissing, his own breath thundering in his ears. "Oh, please," she whispered, her voice a broken thread of sound. That was all it took. "I'm taking her," Mark said, his jaw set like a locked vice. "Alden, you'll lose your permit, the embassy, then I'll lose it." With hands both gentle and unyielding, he lifted her from the ruined seat. She was impossibly light now, her orange skin fever-warm. Against his arms, her silver hair spilled like molten frost over his sleeve as he carried her toward the daylight. Through the smoke, through the heat, through the gasps of protest behind him, he climbed each step a silent vow. She will not die. Not here, not like this. Halfway to his all-terrain rig, her lips moved again, barely audible, soft as the breath of the dying ship. "Nali Novin," she murmured. Mark looked down at her, gripping her closer. "Hang on, Nali. I've got you." Her violet eyes flickered once, then closed, and the last of the warmth in his chest was replaced by a single thought, cold and uncheckable. "If no one else will fight for her life, I will." The workshop smelled of oil and metal dust, a harsh contrast to the sharp scent of burned synthetics that still clung to Mark's jacket. He laid Nali gently on the workbench, its cold surface gleaming beneath the overhead lamps. For years, this bench had been a cradle for dead engines and shattered drone casings. Now it held something infinitely more fragile. Her breathing was shallow, a tremor in each rise of her chest. Blue fluid her blood had dried in streaks along the jagged remnants of her limbs. She was barely clothed, what remained of her flight gear shredded and singed. A gray bandeau top clung stubbornly to her upper torso, while scraps of fabric hinted at what had once been shorts. Mark's hands hovered for a moment, unsure. He'd fixed ships, machines, even patched wounds when accidents hit the mining rigs. But this— "Stay with me," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He slid open a cabinet, pulling out the emergency med kit he kept for hull accidents. Synthetic plasma cartridges. Thank God they were universal for frontier trade. He fumbled, only once before jacking the line into a vein at her neck, watching pale blue fluid mingle with the artificial supplement. Her vitals flickered on the handheld scanner weak, but there, from the corner of the room, Drex's voice broke the tense silence. "You're insane, Alden." The Meridian filled the doorway, his ridged silhouette hard against the night outside. "You know what this means." "Their law says." "Law doesn't mean a damn thing to me right now." Mark snapped without looking up. "It will when the Solarian embassy tears this place apart. You're interfering with sacred customs." Mark shot him a glare sharp enough to cut steel. "She's alive. That's all that matters." Drex stared for a long moment before shaking his head. "You can't fix her. 4 limbs gone? Even their own medics wouldn't try." "Yeah?" Mark muttered, pulling on orange, welding gloves as he examined the severed joints. "Good thing I'm not their medic. She'll never survive the neural shock." Mark's jaw tightened. "Then I'll find a way." Drex hesitated, then muttered something in his guttural tongue before leaving. The door hissed shut, sealing Mark in with the broken girl and the low hum of his machines. He drew a slow breath, rolling his shoulders as his eyes swept over the wall's rows of tools, drawers of alloys, racks of parts cannibalized from derelict drones and scrap haulers. He'd built a dozen contraptions no one thought possible. But this was different. This wasn't about function. This was about life. Mark activated the halotable. Blue light spilled across the bench as schematics flared into existence standard prosthetic designs, neural interface charts, biomechanics references from every databank he could access. His fingers flew, dragging diagrams, cross-referencing. Solarian physiology. Their nervous system was delicate thread-fine conduits, pulsing with bioelectric rhythms. One mistake, and the surge would fry her brain. A whisper cut through the hum. "You should have left me." Mark froze. He turned slowly. Nali's eyes were open now, twin pools of violet glowing faintly under the lamp. Her voice was a rasp, fragile but steady enough to sting. "You're awake," he said softly, pulling a stool closer. "Good. You?" "Don't understand," she managed. "I'm not whole anymore. My people—" Her breath hitched. "They will call me less than nothing." Mark leaned forward, his rough hands curling into fists on his knees. Your people can go to hell. You're not nothing. You're alive. Alive for what? Her eyes locked on his, sharp despite the tremor in her voice. To lie on a table? Useless? Mark stood, his voice low but burning. Not useless, not broken. You hear me? I fix broken things. That's what I do. But you, he pointed to her chest, where her heart still fought against the odds. You're not a thing. You're a fighter. You survived a crash that should have killed you. So don't you dare give up on me now. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed her face. Not hope exactly, but the faintest crack in the wall of despair. What's your name? Mark asked gently. Her lips moved slowly. Nali. He nodded. I'm Mark Alden, and I'm going to help you, Nali Novin. Why? The question was almost a whisper, but it cut deeper than any accusation. Mark paused, his throat tight. Then he answered with the only truth he had. Because I can. Nali's lashes fluttered. Her breath steadied, just barely, as sedation took hold. Mark pulled the blanket over her and turned back to the glowing schematics. His eyes hardened. With the weight of a decision that would change everything, he rolled up his sleeves, the hiss of the welding torch filling the workshop like the growl of a predator. Sparks flared, throwing wild shadows across the walls. This wasn't a repair job anymore. This was war against death, against customs, against the cold logic of those who'd abandoned her dot, and Mark Alden didn't lose wars. Asterisk. The sharp tang of ozone lingered in the workshop air, mixing with the scent of scorched alloy and synthetic resin. Sparks cascaded from the welding torch in Mark's hands, each flash briefly illuminating the shadows that pooled around the cluttered space. For 3 days, the rhythmic hiss of welders and the low hum of servos had been the heartbeat of this place, a pulse mark matched with his own exhaustion. On the workbench, Nali stirred. The hiss of plasma lines feeding her blood had become background. Noise to him, but now the soft hitch in her breath made him look up sharply. Her violet eyes blinked open, glinting under the pale light. For a moment, she looked disoriented, lost between the living and the dead. Then her gaze dropped and froze. Where? Her right arm should have been, a framework of polished metal now extended, sleek as a predator's limb. Interwoven cables pulsed with faint amber light as they threaded into ports fused with the flesh of her shoulder. Fine actuators, joint plates, every curve had been crafted with obsessive precision. Nali inhaled sharply. What have you done? Her voice was a whisper of disbelief, tinged with fear. Started rebuilding, Mark said, his tone quiet but firm as he powered down the welder. His face was drawn, shadowed by fatigue, but his eyes burned with a stubborn fire. She tried to move. The prosthetic twitched, fingers jerking in a dissonant spasm before going still. Don't, Mark warned gently, stepping closer. Neural interface isn't fully stabilized yet. She stared at the alien appendage that now replaced her arm. The metal gleamed under the lights, almost beautiful too beautiful. A cruel mockery of what she'd lost. My people, her voice cracked. They'll call this an abomination. They'll release me anyway. Mark crouched beside her, the faint hum of the prosthetic between them like a third heartbeat. Your people had their chance, he said softly. They left you to die. I didn't. Why? Her eyes, fever bright, locked on his. Why risk everything for me? He hesitated, jaw working as if the words cost him something. Then he said it the same answer he'd given before, stripped bare of hesitation. Because I can. Because it's right. For a long moment, there was only the soft hiss of the plasma feed. Then Nali let out a trembling breath and whispered, You're a fool, human. Maybe, Mark said, allowing the faintest smile to ghost across his face. but on your fool. He reached for the control pad, mounted at her shoulder. Ready to try? Nali's stomach tightened. Will it hurt? A little, he admitted. First handshake between your brain and the prosthetic's core. After that, it gets easier. He keyed the sequence. The interface nodes pulsed once and flooded with amber light. A shiver ran through her, an electric rush that started in her shoulder and raced through phantom nerves to fingers that weren't flesh. She gasped, biting down on a cry as heat flared in her skull, a burning pressure that lasted only a second, before dissolving into something stranger. Not pain, not quite. Sensation. Nali blinked, staring at the metallic hand. Slowly, almost fearfully, she willed the fingers to curl. And they did fluid precise. The servos hummed in perfect sync with her intent. Her breath caught. Stars above. Mark grinned despite himself. Thumb to fingertips. Try it. She obeyed, mesmerized as the prosthetic responded like an extension of her own body. The feedback was uncanny, not like her old arm, but real enough to make her throat tighten. Can feel pressure, she whispered, voice trembling with. Oh, good, Mark said softly. That means the sensory mesh is working. For a heartbeat, silence hung between them, thick and charged. Then, almost without thought, Nali extended her new hand toward him. The metal fingers brushed his jaw, tracing the line of his cheek with feather-like precision. Mark froze, every muscle taut, as her touch lingered. I can feel your warmth, she murmured, wonder softening her voice. The texture of your skin. Their eyes met. For a moment, the hum of the machines faded, the world narrowing to the breathless space between them. Something unspoken sparked raw and dangerous. Mark swallowed hard, stepping back with deliberate care. That's good, he said roughly. Thermal sensors are calibrated. You're blushing, she observed, a faint smile curving her lips. It's hot in here, he muttered, reaching for his tools, though the room was perfectly cool. Nali's smile lingered as she flexed her new fingers, marveling at their strength, their grace. For the first time since the wreck, something fragile bloomed inside her. A flicker of hope. Outside, the night deepened over Meridian's copper horizon. Inside the workshop, a mechanic and an alien girl stood on the razor's edge of a future. Neither of them had imagined a future that had just taken its first trembling step. The council chamber felt like a pressure chamber heat trapped beneath the arched glass dome, the stale tang of recycled air, and the weight of too many eyes. Mark stood at the center of the circular floor, boots planted on polished alloy panels, hands clasped behind his back with a defiance he barely contained. Above him, on a semicircular dais, sat the 5 counselors, their varied forms casting shifting shadows under the pale glow of Meridian's twin suns filtering through the dome. The gallery behind them was crammed with curious onlookers miners, coated in copper dust, merchants in bright fabrics, settlers who'd heard the rumors. And standing near the back, gleaming like a living wound against this sea of neutral tones, was Nali. She hovered on a platform Mark had rigged, her silver-white hair cascading down her back, her new prosthetic arms folded neatly at her sides. The metal gleamed like liquid steel, etched with fine orange lines that pulsed faintly with borrowed life. Where her limbs had been flesh, she was now alloy and fire, a defiance sculpted into form. The murmurs surged when she entered, whispers, rising like restless insects. Solarian, they hissed, modified, abomination, miracle, human Alden, intoned Counselor Trell, the eldest Meridian, his voice rasping like dry sand. You stand accused of performing unlicensed medical alterations and violating interspecies cultural statutes. The Solarian embassy demands this. Situation be rectified. His compound eyes flicked toward Nali with what could only be disdain. Mark's jaw tightened. She's alive because of me. She should not be, hissed a lean, glass-skinned counselor. The covenant of bodily purity is clear. When a body is beyond natural restoration, she wasn't beyond help. Mark's voice cut across the chamber like a blade, startling even himself. He forced his tone lower, steadier. She was abandoned in a burning wreck, left to die because some book of rules decided her life wasn't worth the effort. I disagreed. This is not about your sentiment, Trell replied coldly. It is about law, tradition, and order. Law didn't climb into that wreck, Mark shot back. Tradition didn't pull her out. The tension cracked like ice underfoot. A ripple of murmurs swept through the gallery. Somewhere, someone muttered in agreement. Enough, Trell snapped, but his tone lacked the absolute certainty it had held moments before. Bring her forward. The hover platform hummed softly as Nali guided it to the center, her violet eyes scanning the chamber, with the calm of someone standing at the edge of a blade. When she spoke, her voice carried not loud, but honed with steel. My name is Nali Novin, she began, and the gallery stilled as though the air itself held its breath. Pilot third class of the Solarian merchant fleet. 2 weeks ago, I should have died. That is what my people believe. That is what this council believes. Her gaze swept the dais, unflinching. But I am here, alive, not because of your laws, not because of your mercy, because one human refused to let me vanish into smoke. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, louder this time, voices threading with something like awe. Alive, yes, Trell said sharply. But at what cost? You are neither what you were, nor what you should be. You undermine the very fabric of... The fabric of what? Nali's voice rose, slicing through his words like a vibroblade. A fabric woven from fear? From chains. Disguised as faith? Look at me. She extended her arms, metal fingers splayed wide. Am I less capable than before? Less worthy? Or am I something new? Something stronger? For a moment, silence reigned, thick and brittle. Then a voice from the gallery broke it, a meridian miner with a crude exosplint wrapped around his leg. I say she's right. He barked. Law didn't save her. That man did. Maybe it's time the law caught up. The chamber erupted in noise shouts, protests, cheers tangled in a storm of sound. The counselors exchanged frantic glances as order dissolved like salt in rain. Silence. Trell roared, pounding his gavel until the echoes died. His voice dropped to a razor whisper, cold and deliberate. Enough of this spectacle. The council will deliberate privately. The chamber doors hissed open. As the council withdrew, Mark moved to Nali's side. His voice was low, taut with restrained fury. You didn't have to do that? Yes, she said softly, her gaze locked on the council chamber's ornate archway. I did. Before he could answer, a figure detached itself from the shadows. Near the gallery exit, tall, willowy, dressed in sleek black synthweave that shimmered with shifting iridescence. Its face was long and narrow, lips curling in a smile that didn't touch its pale silver eyes. Impressive performance, the alien purred, its voice like oil over glass. Vex Industries admires innovation and profit. Your work, Mr. Aldenit, could change everything for the right buyer. Mark's stomach nodded, not interested. The alien's smile widened, slow and sharp. Not yet. It pressed the dataship into Mark's hand and vanished into the crowd like a phantom. Mark stared at the chip, unease coiling in his gut. He didn't need to read it to know. This wasn't. Overdot and deep down, as the door sealed and the crowd's hum faded into the charged silence of the empty hall, he understood one truth that burned like plasma in his chest. Whatever decision the council made, the real fight hadn't even begun. ChatGPT said the workshop was alive with shadows, and the hum of dormant machines when the first alarm tripped. A shrill pulse cut through the night, sharp and insistent, dragging Mark from the blueprint sprawled across his holotable. He froze, listening, then cursed under his breath as the outer sensors flared red across the display. Someone was at the door. His first thought was the council back with a ruling, or worse, enforcement drones to drag Nolly away. But when he pulled the security feed, the blood iced in his veins. 3 figures moved through the copper twilight, sleek and deliberate. Too fast, too quiet for local scavengers. Their armor was matte black, segmented for speed, and the rifles slung over their shoulders weren't standard issue for any lawful security force. Mercenaries. Mark killed the lights, heart pounding. The workshop plunged into darkness, broken. Only by the glow of active holoscreens and the faint, pulsing orange of Nolly's prosthetics. She was awake, propped against the wall, silver hair cascading over her shoulder as her violet eyes locked on his face. "What is it?" Her voice was low, steady despite the tension that coiled in the room like a live wire. "Trouble." Mark grabbed the wrench from his belt-heavy solid steel, a relic in an age of plasma cutters, but brutally effective up close. "Stay behind me." Nolly's lips curved in a wry line. "You forget," she said softly, lifting one gleaming arm. "I am not entirely helpless anymore." The door blew inward with a scream of metal, sparks showering across the floor. Smoke and shadow spilled through the breach as 2 mercenaries swept inside, rifles raised, visors glinting like shards of ice. A third followed, a tall, Volurui, with skin the color of tarnished silver and a face too smooth to trust. His voice was silk stretched over steel. "Mark Alden," he said, almost lazily. "You're a hard man to pin down." "Vex." Mark spat the name like a curse. He recognized the smug predator from the council hall. "You've made quite a mess," Vex continued, stepping over the shattered doorframe. "Defying tradition, ignoring law. But oh, what beautiful results." His pale eyes slid to Nolly, and hunger curled at the edges of his smile. "You've created a prototype worth empires." "She's not for sale," Mark growled. Vex tilted his head. "Everything's for sale. The question is price." "Get out," Vex sighed, a sound like silk tearing. "Negotiation is over." He flicked 2 fingers. The mercenaries moved like shadows, rifles snapping up, and Nolly was gone. For a heartbeat, Mark thought she'd fallen. Then a blur of silver and orange crashed into the first mercenary like a thunderbolt. Her mechanical limbs moved with blinding speed, pistons hissing as she wrenched the weapon from his hands and flung him into the wall hard enough to leave a dent. The second spun, firing, bolts searing past Mark's ear as he dove for cover behind the workbench. "Nolly!" he shouted, but she didn't answer. Didn't need to. She was a storm, flowing with a grace no human could match, no Solarian tradition could ever imagine. Her prosthetic fingers closed around the barrel of the second rifle and crushed it like foil. The mercenary slammed a fist into her ribs, and the sound was bone-kneading alloy pain flashed across her face, but her counterstrike sent him sprawling. Then Vex moved, too calm, too precise, pulling a device from his belt, a black disk humming with dangerous energy. "Stop," he said, his voice slicing through the chaos, "or I fry every circuit in this room, including yours, little marvel." Nolly froze mid-step, her breath harsh, silver hair falling into her eyes. Mark saw at the flicker of fear. A full system EMP surge would shut her down instantly. Worse, the neural backlash could kill her. Mark gripped the wrench so hard his knuckles ached. He calculated distances, angles, the impossibility of closing the gap before Vex triggered the device. And then Nellie did something no blueprint had ever predicted. The orange lines along her prosthetics flared bright, molten, alive. Energy pulsed beneath the alloy like liquid fire. She raised one hand, and the air cracked as a wave of electromagnetic force erupted from her palm. The EMP disc screamed, sparked, and died in Vex's hand. For the first time, shock rippled across his perfect face. "What?" Nellie was on. Him before the word finished, slamming him into the wall hard enough to rattle the shelves. Her mechanical fingers closed around his throat, lifting him until his boots scraped against the steel plating. "You wanted to see what these limbs can do," she said, her voice low and dangerous, violet eyes burning like twin stars. "Now you know?" The mercenaries groaned where they lay, weapons shattered. Smoke curled from Vex's ruined device as he struggled for breath, his hands clawing at hers in vain. Mark stepped forward slowly, heart still hammering, the wrench dangling forgotten at his side. He met Nolly's gaze, and in it saw something both terrifying and breathtaking. "Easy," he said quietly, moving closer. "Don't kill him." For a long, taut second, he thought she might ignore him. Then, with emotion almost contemptuous, she released Vex. He crumpled to the floor, coughing, hate smoldering in his pale eyes. "This isn't over," he rasped, staggering toward the shattered door. "You've started something you can't control." When they were gone, silence crashed down like a wave. Mark turned to Nolly. Her prosthetic hands trembled faintly, the glow along their seams dimming as if whatever force she'd unleashed had drained something deep inside. "What was that?" he asked softly, awe and fear threading his voice. Nolly stared at her hands, chest rising and falling in uneven rhythms. "I don't know," she whispered. It felt instinctive, like the power was already there, waiting. Mark swallowed, the weight of what he'd just seen pressing like iron on his ribs. He thought he understood what he'd built. He was wrong. ChatGPT said. The alert hit like a hammer shrill sirens splitting the quiet hum of the workshop, lights flashing crimson across metal walls. Mark's head jerked up from the control panel, heart pounding as the automated voice boomed. "Through the settlement's cum network. Emergency in Sector 7. Mining collapse. Multiple casualties. All personnel report immediately." Mark shot a glance at Nolly. She was perched on the reinforced bench, her new limbs flexing in slow, deliberate motions as she tested motor control. Her silver-white hair was tied back, violet eyes bright, despite the fatigue etched in her features. She met his gaze without hesitation. "Let's go." Mark's stomach clenched. "You're still adapting. Neural loads high." I need to do something," Nolly cut in, her voice sharp as snapped wire. "People are dying, Mark." He stared at her for a beat longer, then cursed under his breath and started moving. Tools hit the table with dull clatters. As he yanked open a supply locker, stuffing portable Medigel packs and neural stabilizers into a field kit. Nolly was already strapping on the hover rig he'd modified for mobility before her legs were complete, the harness locking snug against the sleek alloy of her hips. Minutes later, they tore across Meridian's copper plains in his all-terrain hauler, its engine howling as orange dust spiraled behind them. Ahead, the eastern ridge clawed at the sky, black smoke curling from a wound in its rocky flank. Mark gripped the wheel tighter as they rounded the final bend, and his breath caught. The mining facility was chaos incarnate. Half the main shaft had caved in, a gaping scar vomiting dust and twisted beams. Rescue crews scrambled through clouds of grit, voices raised in desperate shouts as they dragged the injured to makeshift triage zones. The air reeked of ozone and fractured earth, thick enough to taste. Drex was there, barking orders, his ridged face carved in grim lines. He spotted Mark instantly and stormed over, his breathing apparatus hissing in ragged bursts. 12. Miners still trapped beyond the second support ring, Drex rasped. We lost sensors when the secondary collapse hit. Main beams are failing. How long before it all comes down? Mark demanded, eyes scanning the trembling framework. Minutes, Drex growled. Maybe less. Mark turned to Nolly. She had already slid off the rig, her hover harness humming softly, her mechanical arms gleaming like twin blades in the copper light. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That you can buy us time," Mark said grimly. "Those beams, if they go, everyone inside dies." Her jaw tightened. "Point me." Mark grabbed a respirator from the kit, fastening it over her mouth and nose, then snatched up a plasma torch for himself. Together, they plunged into the dust-choked tunnel, the roar of straining supports like the growl of some buried beast. Shadows loomed, fractured by the strobing flash of warning lights. Every step was a gamble. The ground shuddered underfoot, dust cascading from the cracked ceiling in choking waves. They reached the breach, and Mark's stomach knotted. The primary support beam had bent like soft metal, groaning as tons of rock pressed down. A lattice of smaller struts buckled around, it vibrating under the strain. Asterisk. "Mark," Nolly said, voice muffled through the mask. "If that goes, I know." He met her gaze. "Can you hold it?" For a heartbeat, she hesitated. Then her violet eyes hardened with something fierce and unyielding. "Yes." Before. He could stop her. She moved swift and sure, her hover rig cutting through the dust like a blade. She positioned herself beneath the main beam, braced her feet against the fractured flooring, and raised both mechanical arms. The alloy screamed against her grip as she caught the beam mid-buckle. Power surged through her limbs, orange tracery, flaring along the seamless steel like molten veins. The weight slammed into her shoulders like a living thing, grinding down with enough force to pulp bone, if she still had any left there. Mark sprinted past her, voice hoarse. "Hold it, Nolly, just hold." Her teeth clenched, breath tearing from her lungs in ragged bursts. The pressure was agony, a tidal wave crashing through every nerve that still remembered pain. But she didn't break, couldn't break. Not while. Voices screamed beyond the rubble. Mark, and two rescuers tore at the debris, prying loose slabs of shattered rock, dragging bodies free, limbs crushed, faces gray with shock. Time became a cruel blur of dust and blood and grinding metal. "Nolly," he shouted over the chaos. "Status?" Her answer was a snarl, animal and raw. "Move faster." Another section groaned, then collapsed in a roar that shook the tunnel. For a heart-stopping instant, Mark thought it was over until he saw her. Nolly stood like a pillar carved from fire and will, her prosthetics blazing against the dark as the avalanche spilled harmlessly to one side. By the time the last miner stumbled clear, Mark's muscles screamed with exhaustion, his lungs clawing. For air, he turned to her just as her legs buckled. "Nolly!" He caught her before she hit the ground. Her body shook violently, orange light flickering along her arms like dying embers. Her violet eyes fluttered, lips barely moving behind. "The respirator. Did we get them out?" Mark's throat closed. "Yeah," he whispered fiercely, pulling her against him as alarms wailed and sirens pulsed in the distance. "We got them all." Outside, the copper sky burned with dusk as emergency crews swarmed the wrecked shaft. But all Mark saw was the she, woman in his arms, the living paradox he'd saved, who had just saved a dozen more at the edge of annihilation. And in that moment, one truth slammed into him like a freight hauler. Whatever was happening to Nolly, it was bigger than prosthetics. Bigger than survival. It was evolution. Asterisk. The council chamber had never been this full. Word of the mining collapse and the alien woman, who'd held up a mountain, had spread like a solar flare across Meridian. Now every seat in the gallery was Crammed, aliens pressed shoulder to shoulder, their eyes glinting like coins in the pale glow of the chamber's suspended lights. Merchants, miners, smugglers, medics, they were all here, voices thrumming in a low, restless tide. Mark stood at the center of it all, boots planted on the polished alloy floor, fists clenched tight at his sides. Beside him hovered Nali, her platform humming softly, though she no longer needed it to move. Her legs, sleek and silver, chased with glowing orange tracery, were fully integrated now. She wore no attempt at concealment. Her arms, her legs, every line of her prosthetics gleamed like a declaration. She wasn't hiding anymore. If the gallery buzzed, the dais was silent. 5 counselors sat in their carved alloy seats, expressions etched in stone. And between them, in a place of honor, stood Ambassador Tovin Solarian, draped in shimmering ceremonial fabrics, his every movement precise, his every word honed to cut. "This," he began, voice resonant, "is not a debate of politics or economics. This is a matter of survival, of the covenant that defines my people. Bodily purity is the cornerstone of Solarian identity. Without it, we cease to be what we are." His gaze cut to Nali like a blade of glass. "You, Novin, are no longer Solarian. You are something else. An abomination, birthed from human arrogance." The chamber erupted gasps, shouts, the hiss of voices in a dozen tongues. Mark felt the heat rise in his chest like an uncontrolled reactor. He took a step forward, voice sharp enough to slice through the din. "An abomination?" He spat. "She saved 12 lives yesterday. 12 miners who'd be corpses under a ton of rock, if not for her." He swung toward the council, his voice climbing, raw with conviction. "Where were your laws then? Where was your mercy when she was bleeding out in a burning wreck?" "Enough," Tovin snapped, his composure cracking for the first time. "Heroics do not excuse heresy. The ritual of release is not cruelty, it is sanctity." Nali's voice slid through the tension like a blade drawn slow from a sheath. "Sanctity?" Her hover rig powered down, and she stepped forward on gleaming legs, each motion liquid grace, her violet eyes luminous. "Your sanctity would have left me to die in the dirt. Tell me, Ambassador, what is sacred in that?" Tovin's mouth tightened. "What you are cannot be allowed to spread." Nali's chin lifted, defiance burning like plasma. "It already has." Mark followed her gaze to the gallery and saw it. The injured miner she'd saved. A Visari woman with a skeletal prosthetic glinting where her shattered arm had been. A pair of Volari twins with neural ports peeking from beneath their collars. Dozens of them, eyes bright with something dangerous to tradition. Hope. Tovin saw it too. His composure cracked, voice sharpening. "This council must act before this. Contagion undermines every pillar of order." Before Trull could respond, the chamber doors boomed open with a sound like distant thunder. Conversation died in an instant as figures swept inside 6 beings in white and silver, their insignia glinting with the sigil of the Galactic Medical Coalition. At their head strode a human woman in a slate-gray coat, hair cut in a severe line, her voice ringing like a struck bell. "Apologies for the intrusion," she said, though her tone carried no hint of apology. "Director Elara Johnson, Nexus Division. We've been monitoring this case." Her gaze landed on Nali, sharp and assessing. "Extraordinary work." Tovin surged to his feet, scandal blazing in his amber eyes. "Coalition interference is a violation of jurisdiction." "Spare me," Johnson cut in coolly. "The Coalition's charter supersedes local ordinances where emergent medical paradigms are concerned. And what we have here," she gestured to Nali, her silver limbs gleaming like molten moonlight, "is not just prosthetic advancement. It is a new class of biomechanical integration, adaptive, neural symbiotic, voluntary." Her words rippled through the chamber like an energy surge. Johnson stepped forward, her voice dropping to something almost reverent. Nali Novin, under Galactic Charter Section 47, you qualify for protected evolutionary status. You are not a violation, Ambassador. You are precedent. A council erupted. Voices crashed like storm waves, shock, outrage, wonder, greed. Tovin's face was a mask of fury. This is treason. He hissed. No, Johnson said, her eyes like cold fire. It's progress. She turned to Mark, and for the first time, her expression softened. Mr. Alden, the Coalition is establishing a Nexus research hub on neutral ground. We want you and her at its head. Lead this work. Share it. Shape it before someone else does. Mark stared at her, heart thundering, the offer slamming. Into him with the force of an asteroid. Before he could answer, a low murmur slid like poison through the chamber. Vex, standing at the edge of the crowd, his silver eyes glittering with promise and threat. His smile was a blade. This changes nothing, he said softly, his words carried on the hush like smoke. You can crown them pioneers. We'll still own the future they build. Mark met his gaze, a silent war flaring between them. Then he looked at Nali, her eyes held his, and in them he saw no fear-only resolve fierce enough to burn worlds. The council chamber dissolved into chaos. Security swarmed. Coalition envoys raised their sigils. Tovin shouted in a tongue edged with venom. And through it all, Nali stood beside Mark, her metal fingers brushing his hand in a quiet vow that spoke louder than any words. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Asterisk. The stars burned like molten silver against the black of the void, their cold fire mirrored in the polished hull of Nexus Station. Suspended at a Lagrange point between two systems, the station gleamed like a crown rings of living steel spinning. In silent harmony, their lights a lattice of civilizations, converging for something entirely new. Mark stood at the observation deck, the galaxy sprawling beyond the glass, his reflection ghosted against infinity. Behind him, the hum of activity was constant. Voices in a dozen languages, footsteps, the muted hiss of automated doors. He rested his hands on the railing, trying to ground himself against the enormity of what lay ahead. 2 months ago, he'd been a mechanic on a dust-stained frontier world, fighting rust and bureaucracy with equal futility. Now he was co-director of the Galactic Integration and Rehabilitation Center, a name that sounded far too clinical for what it really was: a sanctuary. A forge for futures. The doors whispered open. He didn't need to turn to know it was her. Nali moved like liquid grace, each step whisper quiet, her silhouette haloed by the soft glow of bioluminescent panels. She had shed the hover rig weeks ago, her legs sleek alloy chased with living. Orange light moved in perfect synchronicity with the rest of her body. Her silver-white hair spilled like molten frost over her shoulders, contrasting sharply with the obsidian-black tunic that clung to her frame. She joined him at the railing, her reflection merging with his in the glass. "You're brooding again," she murmured, her voice a quiet ripple in the vast silence. "Just thinking," Mark replied, eyes still on the spiraling galaxies beyond. "About everything we left behind, and everything ahead?" She countered gently. He turned then, and for a moment words failed. In the glow of the viewport, her violet eyes seemed to hold whole star fields, depth shimmering with something not quite human anymore. "How are you feeling?" he asked, though it was a poor disguise for the worry beneath. Nali's lips curved into a faint smile. "Better than I ever did before the crash. Stronger, faster." Her gaze drifted to her hands, the metal fingers flexing, light pulsing along their seams in time with her heartbeat. "But it's more than that," Mark frowned. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then raised her arm. For an instant, Nothing happened, then the metal shimmered. Orange lines brightened to molten gold, then fractured like veins of liquid. Fire. The alloy seemed to soften, flowing, reshaping itself, with a sound like whispering wind. Mark's breath caught as the arm thinned, its structure realigning, until what lay before him was no longer cold metal, but something alive flesh. The color of sunlit copper, warm beneath the soft glow of the viewport. I don't. He took a step closer, heart hammering. Nellie, how? Her voice was hushed, almost reverent. It started after the mining collapse. At first, just flickers. Heat where there should be none. Now, she turned her restored arm, and the hum. Skin rippled and melted back into alloy with seamless grace. The prosthetics aren't just integrating. They're evolving. My body isn't rejecting them. It's merging with them, replicating them. Mark stared, awe and a flicker of unease coiling in his gut. You're saying, this isn't mechanical anymore. No, she whispered. It's something else, something new. Silence stretched. Between them, vast as the void beyond the glass. Finally, Mark found his voice. Does it hurt? Nolly shook her head slowly, silver hair spilling like liquid light. No, it feels right, like I'm not bound by what I was before. Not by the laws of flesh. Not by the chains of tradition. Her gaze lifted to his, and something fierce and luminous burned there. This isn't just survival, Mark. It's evolution. He reached for her hand, warm now, impossibly warm, and clasped it between his own. For a heartbeat, metal and flesh and something beyond, both merged in the smallest of gestures. A promise forged in silence. You're not alone in this, he said, voice low, steady. Whatever comes next, we face it together. Her fingers tightened, strength coiled in their touch. Not just mechanical strength, but something deeper, wilder. Together, she echoed, her voice a vow and a warning all at once. Behind them, the station pulsed with life. Beyond the glass, stars wheeled in endless arcs. And somewhere in that infinite dark, forces were already stirring, corporations sharpening their claws, empires whispering of blasphemy, entire civilizations trembling on the edge of a revelation they could neither stop nor contain. Mark and Nolly stood at the heart of it all, unaware or perhaps unafraid that the choice they'd made in a dusty workshop had ignited a chain reaction that would shake the galaxy to its bones, because this was no longer about prosthetics, no longer about saving one life. This was the birth of a new kind of being, and revolutions, like stars, are born in fire. * The end.